Welcome back to Brothers in Boots. My name is Mike,
Name is Jeff.
and today we will be continuing the discussion of the welt types that we had last time, where the conversation got very real, and not real like in a bad way, but got real in an organic way. We're gonna go into how muddy the waters here are, and they are quite muddy. But if you like this kind of content, please like, comment, subscribe. And from here, we're going to go through so a week has passed since we recorded. And there's been a lot of uh, back and forth discussion between me and Jeff, a lot of research, reaching out to different builders, both American and Indonesian, and trying to get a good perspective on this. And the answer is all these definitions are a lie. It's all muddy. None of them hold stones. So we're going to go over those and why here. And then we're also going to kind of level the playing field for how we're going to use the terms going forward. So at least it's consistent. As consistent as it can be.
And,
It's pretty muddy. It's a tar pit. It really is.
and because people have asked, this week is Four Roses Select, small batch select,
It's a good one. It's a very
103
cherry one.
proof, NCF. It's excellent for the money, and especially for one that's still pretty easy to find.
Yeah, it's a little expensive in Kansas. It comes in around $58 in Kansas, but like in Missouri, it's like $37. It's kind of one of the strange things. Got to be a weird allocation tax, but it is good. It's a very cherry one. Like if you like kind of sweet candy, that's definitely one that palates up with that.
Usually pay about 40, 45. Yeah, that's a good pour. Okay, so yeah, like you said, last week's episode was it devolved. It devolved at the end, and we decided to leave it up in its entirety because it was real and organic, and real discussion seemed valuable because we were realizing that construction type and definitions are not as clear as we thought, and that it's our understandings lie more in just what we've come into contact with and who we've been talking to as to how we saw it. Different roads, and that really no absolutes to it,
Oh,
which
that's the
is
understatement of the
is,
century.
disheartening. So we spent the last week deep diving. We asked questions to clear things up. We talked to several builders, some cobblers, and went into the forums and web pages and various images, and of course talked a lot amongst each other. And everything on the subject is forever muddy as fuck. It's um, but at least we can explain why it's forever muddy as fuck, and how understanding that can be valuable towards speaking the same language, knowing what you're getting, knowing what you're essentially getting, and what you should expect when you're talking to people, and maybe how you can clear up when you're talking with people to make sure that you're speaking the right language. Um, so one of the things that we found pretty early on when we were discussing this, and I don't know if the video made it, the picture made it up in last week's episode, but we found a page that we're going to put up from a book called About Shoes,
It's up.
and you can see on it that there's four diagrams presented on one page by one person that are all examples of Norwegian. I mean, there you go, is one person who can't even give you a clear definition.
Yeah,
So
and these are
some
strange too. Like the Norwegian is really the what they call the true Norwegian, mimics something a little closer to like what you would see with Stitch Down, except for it creates a cavity that you would see more likely in something like a hand welted or a Goodyear welted boot or shoe. Um, and when you go to the bottom corner of almost the exact same construction, they do it without a cavity, which makes you wonder. And that's what they're calling Norwegian construction, which is just Italian for Norwegian. And it makes you kind of wonder, why would you even have these two? Why create a cavity when you don't need to create a cavity, when everything else about this construction is identical? It is upper to liner to insole. One just has an insole with cavity created for no reason, and one doesn't. But besides that, these two constructions are identical. And then you have Norwegian welted, which is what most of us generally think of as Norwegian, which makes sense, has what we would expect it to. And then you have this abomination called reverse welted construction, which is essentially doing the same thing as Norwegian welted, except for adding a piece of vamp upper leather in between the outsole and the insole with its cavity to have the vamp color match through in the heel stack for a reason. Much thinner piece of leather.
We found definitions that say that that the vamp terminates at the midsole. Definitions that say that it folds inward. Definitions saying it folds outward. Some say the lining folds in, but the vamp folds out. Some say that it does use a physical welt. Some say that it does not use a physical welt. And by that, I mean a separate welt. Because like we said in previous episodes, we sometimes use welt in two different ways. Sometimes welt we use to mean whatever method was used to put it together. And other times we use it more the way it literally should be used, which is to mean a separate piece of material, usually leather, that joins the two. It kind of goes between the two to put the uppers and the lowers together. And even when we're comparing two brands out of the same city, where one brand is an offshoot of the other, we even find two definitions given there for what a Norwegian rolled welt is. They both roll the liner inward, and they're both using a rolled welt, which I can explain better in a second, to cover the actual welt stitching, the real welt stitching, for better water resistance. But with one of those brands, they're rolling the vamp inward as well, which is whites. And with the other brand, Frank's, they're rolling the vamp outward and stitching it down. And like I said, I mean, one evolved from the other. You would really expect them to be the same. Some of the employees at one place worked at the other place. Some employees at the other place worked at the first place. There's a lot of employees that have worked at both places, but yet they don't do it the same. And I don't know which one's better. I mean, it's you can't say which one's better. They're different. The Franks would be more water resistant by having your actual vamp rolled outward for water to roll down. And it's also having the actual welt stitches covered. But as I showed you on the green boot last week, by doing that, you've got a thick piece of leather that's showing out when it's rolled out. You can actually see a thick piece of leather that it's rolled out. If this was a white's boot, you wouldn't see that thick piece of leather because it's rolled inward.
You see it like that, it looks just like a regular piece.
So the white's one looks cleaner. It looks more, more casual, more professional.
Streamlined.
Streamlined. Not quite as tough or water resistant. And like I said, it's a trade-off, but they both use the same exact definition. And like I said, they're in the same city and one evolved from the other. So what we're trying to say here is that these definitions are just always different, and each manufacturer is saying it in a different way. The rolled welt, um, we've now talked about this twice, and Mike put up some two pieces of leather that were actually kilties. Try to show how that goes, but I thought maybe I found this thing in the back room, and if Mike puts up that photo.
Yep, the black one. Yeah, right here you can see where they're folding it down and where it's stitched through right there, and it's a separate piece right there.
So
And then
that's
I'm
why
going
he's
to grab
saying
it so you can see.
reversed,
Yep.
because you see that rough out of that leather that's stitched on. So it's going to go, it's naturally going upward by itself. And then they're going to fold it down over the actual welt. And so use this as an example. I don't know if it's going to work for people or not, but it really screamed at me when I saw it. If we envision this open tube area as the welt, as an exaggerated welt, and we've got that piece that we're looking at, that piece of leather is going up, coming back down and rolling over the real welt, and then it's laying flat where it gets stitched down onto midsole.
And in that
You think that
picture, your
may have been helpful
stitches
to
would be.
anybody or just
Yep.
confusing?
Well, it helps because if you think about it, your stitches would then be protected inside that tube, right? So the stitches wouldn't be exposed to the outside.
Right. So I don't know if that helped people or not, but it screamed at me when I saw it. And then when we talk about separate welts, then a lot of them are going to be an L shape. I brought this out for, but if this is a piece of leather, cardboard that was a packing material. But if this was a piece of leather, then you would have stitch going through the upper part of the L, go into most likely the vamp. And then you'd have a stitch going downward to most likely go through the midsole. I say most likely because instead of the vamp, that could be going through a wall. Goodyear welt has a wall that goes upward on the inside, a hand welt, various different
it could be going through
welts
a
done
liner.
by hand.
Yep.
We're going to have a wall of leather.
Yep.
And then there's some that are not an L shape. Some are just flat. In which case it'd be stitching down into something here, and then here will be going down into the midsole. I don't know. Maybe it wasn't helpful. Maybe it only worked in my own mind. But some of these things are hard to visualize to me. I look at all these photos on the internet, and even though I know what I'm looking at, sometimes it's a little hard to look at the pictures and realize what you're looking at and when there's a separate vamp and when there's not a separate vamp. I mean, I knew what Mike was talking about last week, showing the kilties, and even I had to think for a second of, hey, what am I looking at, and what does it mean? And I wish we could show boots that are in the middle of being completed so that we could actually stop and show each one of these things visually. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to cipher, to put in place. Anyway, moving on, the Veldshone is another example, much in the same vein. I kind of wonder sometimes whether Veldshone is really any different than Norwegian. Like, is it a synonym? And it sometimes seems like they're used interchangeably, even if they're not synonyms. You got people, like you said a few minutes ago, that they'll try to explain, oh, well, this is Norwegian and this is Norvegese, which Norvegese is actually just Italian for Norwegian. So, same thing. It can't be different. The other thing that we have that causes confusion to me, and it caused confusion for Mike and I talking this week, is the word hand welt, because hand welt can be used two different ways depending on who you're talking to. It could either be, could say, hey, this boot was completely welted by hand welt. But there's other people that use it to describe a specific construction type that goes further than just saying that it's hand welded. And then even amongst the people that say that it's a specific construction type, their definition isn't always the same as another specific construction type that someone else describes it as. And yes, it should sound confusing because it is.
It'll help to think of hand welting as more of a category, and that there's multiple types of hand welting, which both Weltshone, Norwegian, and some of the other stuff we've talked about are technically types of hand welting, but the term is loosely used to explain flat welting, which is kind of how we're going to explain it going forward. Now, if we do use them interchangeably, we apologize, but we're going to call what most people will say is hand welting flat welt, or hand inseam welting going forward.
Goodyear welted causes confusion amongst people as well. Some people think of it as a construction type, meaning that it could be done by hand or by machine, while others think it means anything made completely by machine only. There is, of course, a specific Goodyear welting machine. It was invented by Charles Goodyear, son of the man who invented vulcanizing, who used that invention to found Goodyear tires. Another fun fact for us boot nerds is that the Goodyear family was a long time Cobbler family, and they handed it down from generation to generation. They were all cobblers. So when Mr. Goodyear discovered vulcanizing, he was actually trying to use that to make rubber-soled shoes. So he was actually performing his duties as a cobbler when he discovered the vulcanizing, which led him to found Goodyear Tire. Back on subject, you'll never hear a bespoke make builder saying that a boot is Goodyear welted, but you kind of got to look at their point of view on it. I mean, they're spending 5, 6, 7 hours welting a boot by hand. They certainly wouldn't want that compared to a Goodyear welting machine that's going to make a boot and that's going to do the same thing, and not the same thing, but they're going to put it together in 5 minutes.
Yep. So
that's a big thing. You want to make a distinction professionally.
Yep. And to keep in mind, a Goodyear welted boot, and that's what we'll call it going forward, is Goodyear welted. We won't use the term Goodyear welt construction. I'm sure there'll be websites that say that, but the good ones will call it Goodyear welted. Implies 3 things specifically. 1, there's a gimming. 2, it was machine lasted, because it has to be. You can't hand last it and then use a Goodyear welting machine. And number 3, the machine is the one that puts the welt on. Now, in that process, it will you'll put everything in the machine. The machine will pull it over across your insole with your gimming that's been glued down to it, which is replacing a holdfast. It will staple the uppers to the gimming, and then the machine will welt the actual welt to the gimming through the uppers and lining, obviously.
And those are the 2 weak points, by the way. Besides that it's not done by hand, the biggest weak points for a Goodyear welt are what he just said, the gimming and the staples.
Yep.
And the gimming, what is a gimming?
It's a canvas.
A gimming is, or a canvas wall.
Well, it's
as I
a
would
sorry, it's
say.
a canvas rib. It's a piece of canvas that's got some plastic or some kind of structure piece running through it that's put over that's glued down. It's replacing the carved channel of a holdfast, but it's not a single piece unit like a holdfast is. Like there's glue involved. Some people, like cobblers, good ones, sometimes will like sew it down to the insole. But keep in mind when you do that, there will be stitches visible inside the boot now or shoe.
So if this is the gimming wall that's sticking up, I guess you can't really see that. But this would be the welt, and these two things would stitch together. That would be the construction. So this wall is on the inside, sticking up from your midsole. So they're going to get stitched together in the construction. So that's why that wall is necessary. And if it was being done by hand, then the cobbler or the builder could build a leather wall by carving into the midsole, have the same effect.
Yep. It's Goodyear welting also creates the largest cavity of any of the constructions. So, like the way the gimming works and how much the machine needs to do that gap is a lot. I mean, it's in the 3 to 5 millimeter range, where most of the other ones are only going to be in that maybe 1 mil range at the most, and sometimes and oftentimes quite a bit less.
So sticking with the Goodyear welting, Goodyear welted, how you want to phrase it. Uh, if you talk to a cobbler, you're probably going to hear different terminology than that builder would have given, because that cobbler is probably repairing a job that was already done. So if somebody brought to them a boot that was originally Goodyear welted by a machine, said, I want you to rebuild this boot, and that cobbler is going to tear everything apart, put it back together again. When he puts it back together again, he's very likely going to say that he's Goodyear welting the boot. When, of course, he's not, because he's not using a machine. But he is trying to use those same holes that were originally put in by that machine. So is he using the term correctly? I don't know. I mean, if the person receiving the information understands what he says, then I guess that's what's important. But it's an example of what we're saying about everything being muddy, because different people will use things in different ways at different times from different points of view to mean different things.
It's important to note on that, the reason we're pushing so hard on the reusing the old holes is specifically because in reusing the old holes, they're maintaining the lasted shape that existed before they took the welt off. So they don't need to relast or have a last to fix that shape. They're maintaining the exact same size and placement. Whereas if they punched new holes willy-nilly, they would be changing that, especially without a last, which in effect would be going against the original lasting and more or less relasting the boot or shoe. So reusing those holes is maintaining the lasting and the original welting that the Goodyear welt machine did, which is why they use the terms in the way they do to try to help people understand what they're doing.
And you'll see good cobblers go away from that a little bit sometimes. I was watching a video last week. We shouldn't name names, but I watched a cobbler who was taking a boot that was a 270 Goodyear welted boot, and the owner wanted a 360. And so when he redid it, he did it in a way where he flipped out the heel and put new holes in order to make it a 360. And again, he still said he was doing a Goodyear 360 welt, even though he wasn't using a machine.
But as long as you
So
use the 270 theoretically, and we're getting real theoretical here, the lasting should be the Goodyear welting machines last, with whatever slight changes get made to the heel area. But we're definitely getting into very brown waters at this point when it comes to that, because what do you call that? Is that really Goodyear welting at that point? Or is he really creating a new, chimera style construction that's really mixing multiple processes? Thus the muddy.
which is a situation where, he could have called it a hand welt instead. We started to say a minute ago, hand welt is a term that gets used. I think it's a bad term. I don't like the term. Wish to never see anybody using it. And if I do hear somebody saying hand welted boot, I'm going to ask them what kind of hand welt. And they're going to say, I don't know, it's a hand welt. And I'm going to say, okay, well, I can think of 6 different kinds of hand welts. Again, I mean, that's where we're fucking muddy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, anything that's hand inseam welted from, well, honestly, all the construction types except for the ones done specifically by the Goodyear welted machine, are hand welts. Norwegian reverse welted, Norwegian welted. These are all done by hand with a holdfast through a channel. Now, maybe there's a machine that can simplify some of these constructions. Like there is a inverted Goodyear welt machine that does make what looks like a Norwegian welt. But, is it really Norwegian welt? Is it going to match the exact pictures we've shown so far? No, but it's going to be close. And that kind of seems to be the moral of the story here, is a lot of what is happening here is being labeled by what is close.
Or how they want to define it.
Yep.
Or what they want to put forth in the customer's mind. Which isn't necessarily successful, but they're going to try to make it successful.
Marketing jargon.
The hand welt, to me, it just sounds generic, like a lack of a name or a category said. Sometimes in history, that hand welt would have been called a turn shoe. Turn shoe is an old construction term that was used. It historically means that a shoe was actually created and sewn together inside out, and that it got flipped outward when they were done turning the shoe from inside out to right side out. It was used after people started turning the shoes inside out, so it was a term that existed outside of that action. But it is a term that has fallen out of favor. It's not, I don't think it's ever used by anybody anymore. But it was better, it meant something. It was better than saying hand welting, because it actually meant something. People at the time would have known what a turn shoe construction means.
Yep. And to be clear on that, turn shoe construction goes as far back as like 500 AD and is used up in pictures we've found consistently till at least the 1500s. Now, the construction methods weren't exactly the same. What we saw in the books that showed how it would have been done in the 1500s is a lot closer to modern flat welting, but the process still holds. Just like we still turn bags after we make them these days. That's still a process that's done, turning the bag out once it's almost complete.
Well, as Mike said, we've both kind of determined that when you see the term hand welt used today, 8 times out of 10, 7 times out of 10, what do you say?
High percentage.
That it's actually a flat welt.
Yep.
Doesn't have to be, but more often than not, probably is. So, I guess in an attempt to clear things up just a little bit, Machine made is certainly a category, and that category includes vulcanizing and Goodyear welted and Norwegian. Hand welt is a category, in my eyes at least, and that category would include flat welt, storm welt, Norwegian rolled welt, Feldshone, split welt, and stitch down. Think of any I missed? There's probably more hand welts out
There's
there.
probably more than that, and stitch down is different than like a Jim Green machine stitch down. But to Jim Green's credit, they do specifically call it out as machine stitch down, meaning it's machine last and machine stitch down. But yes, I'm sure there's more that we missed. There's probably 100.5 other types. Okay, right off the top, double welt, double flat welt. There's one we missed. That's one that has to be done by hand.
So it basically means that if you want to be clear on how any builder is building your boots, you really need to ask them. It doesn't matter to you. Most people, it probably doesn't matter to them. But if it matters, you should probably ask some questions to try to verify or confirm what's really going on. And that can be difficult. I mean, if the person you're dealing with and English isn't their first language, it would certainly be a huge task to ask these questions. So we did talk to Mike talked to both Renav and Tahara this week, and they both of them use 4 different terms. In last week's video, we said 3, but we forgot about one of the more pedestrian ones, and shame on us. So one of those uses no physical welt. One uses a welt made out of the same leather as the vamp. 2 use a welt made out of the midsole leather, thin down. And so we tried to detail out what each one of the 4 is according to them in their builds. Number 1, they call a hand welt, a flat welt. It uses a piece of thinned midsole as the welt. It would be the one I was talking about earlier with a flat welt. So it'll be stitched to one part here and one part here.
Hey,
so
Jeff.
It gets stitched down twice. The welt holds it together.
Hey Jeff, can you go ahead and shut your video on and off real quick? Your video's starting to lag behind a little bit. Perfect. Good to go.
Yeah.
Yep. Sorry about that. I noticed it was starting to get a little bit behind, and someone was going to ask about it in the comments. Anyway, like I said, he's talking about welt.
Yeah, it would. In that situation, you're going to have it's going to stitch. It's going to have stitches to the vamp and the liner and the midsole on one side, and then on the other side, as you look down, it's going to go straight down into the midsole from your outside view. So when you're looking down at your boots, you're going to see a welt that looks exactly like the midsole. So it looks like you're looking at the midsole. You're actually looking at a piece of leather laying on top of it. And that's their most basic offering. It's the one that they're the least proud of. It's the one that you're least going to see done. It's the one that we omitted last week when discussing, because it's used so seldom. You do have one, right? It's built out of that?
Yeah, it's in a box. It's a double row. I have a single flat welt. But if we want to look at like a double welt here, a double welt really is just a flat welt. So this is just 2 flat welts essentially. So like if this didn't have a double welt and you looked at just this piece right here, this is what a flat welt would be. Like it is a separate piece of leather that passes through. It is perpendicular with the uppers as they're tucked and passes through that gap. If you look at this picture right here, this right here is called Norwegian welted construction. If you imagined this welt passing under and doing the exact same thing, that's exactly what it is. That is what this is at the end of the day. Is the welt is passing under where it's tucked under. It is thinned down, so there's like a 22-degree angle, and when they're welting it, they're passing the needle through the welt itself, into the upper leather, into the liner, through the wall of the holdfast channel, to the other side, passing the needle through and pulling tight. And that's what that's doing. So it's creating what is essentially a 90-degree surface plane by making them perpendicular.
And this one will have a cavity, although not much of one, very little.
Yep, very thin.
And they use a piece of leather to fill in that cavity.
It's very roughed up on both sides to not squeak.
Which is really nice, and I was very happy to hear that. Many builders would use cork in that situation. I'm definitely not a fan of cork personally. I probably have a bigger problem with it than most. I don't like cork.
It's better than carpet filling, which you do get with Wolverine 1000-mile boots. Recycled carpet pad.
The number 2 build that they do, they call Weltschon. It uses no physical welt. So the liner, and we have a picture, I think that's that
Yep.
exact
It's close.
setup.
I've showed it once here, so I've got it on the screen right now.
The liner is going to get folded underneath, and when it gets folded underneath, it's going to get a whip stitch.
Here's an example of a whip stitch right here. This is from Texas Traditions, but this is what a whip stitch is right here. This is where they just, obviously around the toe area, this is going to be flat welted, but they pass it through the liner that's folded over in the upper just directly into the midsole with no channel carving, just enough to create physical attachment and not really create any void. Now, I'm back on the Weltschon.
The vamp is going to get folded outward. So when you're looking down at your shoes, the leather that you're looking at is the same exact leather of your vamp, of your boots. And that will get stitched down to the midsole. So in that situation, like I said, no welt. Because the leather is getting flipped outward and it's only the liner, there's really no cavity. So they're gonna put it together with no filler.
Yeah, this picture is going to
show
nice filler here, but where it's showing welt here, this is actually just the midsole passing through. So we found a picture of Weltschon construction, but it's not the correct one for this. We couldn't find a picture for exactly this. So at this layer where it's pointing like this welt piece, imagine this is a midsole that passes through the middle with little to no gap, that doesn't even need a filler piece. And then the rest of the construction is the exact same.
That's my favorite construction.
I mean, if you watched a pair of Nicks or Franks or Whites or JK in any of their like YouTube or Instagram or wherever you get your video content, doesn't matter, and you see the phase they get to where they pull the nails out of the last, they cut the upper and fold it out, and they trim the liner flush, that's the stage that both these guys would whip stitch the liner to the insole, and then the pieces of upper would get stitched to the midsole instead of getting nailed down. So like in a Franks or a Whites, they're going to nail those parts down. So you're going to get quite a few extra nails right there through the throat area of the boot, which is the waist to the back of the heel. And then the upper's folded out. So in this case, they're going to fold that upper out in the same way, whip stitch that on to maintain its last shape. And then from there, the construction will almost be identical to a stitch down from that point forward, minus Frank's using the McKay lock stitch.
Well, actually, there wouldn't be a McKay lock stitch on a Norwegian rolled welt.
There wouldn't be,
It
but
would
it'd
only be
be
on the stitch down.
yeah, but the welt shown from this point is going to be exactly like a stitch down from that point. So everything else construction wise, and to help this out, when I was talking to Ray from Renov, he watched one of the Nick's videos of building and compared his process to that one. And from his words, his welt shown is basically the same thing as the stitch down we would see. So we call it the machine stitch down. I think White's calls their line CS for anything that's the machine stitch down. Frank's just calls theirs everything they do that's not Norwegian rolled welt. And Nick's only does that, except they don't do the McKay lock stitch. So now, a couple things that were said that I had to kind of read between the lines because not first language is they kept calling thread cheap. So that implies to me that nails might be expensive or potentially reused, which explains why the whip stitch versus the nails. Now in traditional shoemaking, less nails always more better. Whether that holds up in modern terms, one in the hands, two in the bush. I mean, the other thing is they don't seem to trust their glue very much. Some of it's probably climate, but if any of you guys have had these Indonesian brands and gotten your heel stacks wet, you'll find that the lifting pieces tend to separate a little easier after getting wet. So it leads to, whether it's like an environmental thing in their country, just the cheapness of the glue, but the glue does not seem to be as high quality as what we use for bootmaking in America, which would be like your Rinias, your Masters, your Barge. Does not seem to be up to the same quality level from that perspective, which
Even if it was, up to the quality level, that's a very humid area. They probably would have to wait too long for the glue to dry. But when you use the glue, the stitching would actually be faster for them.
Space seems to be a premium.
So it's
well.
one or the other or both
Yeah.
of those two things. So,
Yep.
The number 3 type would be, there is what they call a Norwegian. And the Norwegian,
it's the Norwegian welted picture. This one here.
In that situation, the vamp and the liner both get folded under and stitched to the midsole. Then a welt made out of midsole leather but thinned would be used. See this again. And it will be shaped like an L, so the top part of the L would be going into the vamp. The bottom part of the L is going to go straight down to the midsole. So when you look down on that one, it'll look like you're looking at the midsole, just like that flat welt, or they call it hand welt. But you're actually going to be looking at a welt that looks just like it, and it's going to be stitched down. And that one will have a cavity, and they say that their cavities are filled with leather. It's nice. So that's your Norwegian. And then the fourth one is the rolled welt, Norwegian rolled welt. So again, I mean, this is going to, the vamp and liner folded under and stitched. But this time, the welt is going to be taller, and it's going to be made out of the same leather as the vamp, probably thinned. And it's going to go, like I said with this thing, it's going to go up, it's going to go around, it's going to flatten back down and get stitched. So that roll is actually covering the actual stitches. And the cavity would be filled with leather. There would be a cavity on that one as well, and it would get filled with a thin piece of leather. So that's the different kinds for at least those 3 Indonesian brands. It may or may not be the same for the others. We haven't asked them. At least I haven't asked them.
This was
Do
not
you have any first-hand knowledge on any of the others?
No, and this was not an easy conversation. This took the better part of a week. There was language barrier struggles here quite a bit. This was a tough one. The other thing is Renav and Tahura are in Badung and not Jakarta, where the majority of these guys are in Jakarta. Or I might have got that backwards. It's one of the two, but they're not in the same city that a lot of the big guys are. They're both big cities, but this is just not the same city. But from that perspective, the same thing. Well, go ahead.
Sedona is where most of them are. I think you do have it reversed.
It could be. Sure. It might be on their Instagram, but when it comes down to it, like a lot of these same principles apply here in the States as well. Like these terms are used pretty liberally as a like outline kind of definition, more so than some kind of rule or law on how to do them. We can kind of categorize them in a law kind of way in terms of a couple specific categories, but I mean you're still talking, it's a very top level explanation, because I mean we've talked about the Norwegians that make sense here, and I've got another picture here of kind of, this is from an Italian book that's showing kind of the same thing with the L-shaped welt being tucked under, so on and so forth, cork filler, midsole, channel insole. This one just isn't in Japanese terms, but like Norwegian, we found like 7 different definitions of Norwegian. Like some have the L-shaped welt and still tuck the upper under for no reason. Like there's no reason to make the extra upper tuck except to expose your vamp to more, weather instead of leaving it in. So all of these seem very fluid. Now that being said, we say they seem fluid. We found examples of them being fluid. There seems to be a pretty, I don't want to say universal, like a 60% consensus on how the terms are used, that you will be within 80% of whatever definition was given. So stitch down minus some caveats on how they do it slightly differently means your vamp is getting fold out and it's stitched down regardless of whatever method it's used to maintain the last shape, whether that's McKay lock stitch, whether that's just pure glue, and like in the case of Nick's, so on and so forth. There is a 80% correctness in these terms, but understanding that 80% correctness is the hard part, because some of these 80% correctness, like for example hand welting, still leaves you with like 6 different options, 7 different options. They do seem to be consistent to a certain extent once you divide them out to a particular level, but you can't go up or down from that definition. The second you do, we go pure mud. In the words of Bob Ross, we've gone from painters to mud mixers real fast. Someone quoted it on a shoemaking forum on Reddit pretty well, and that is, the shoe industry is the Wild West of terms. People just kind of slap whatever they think will make it sell on there, which is why I called it marketing jargon earlier, because these days people praise the power of a Goodyear welt, which is the cheapest of the welt constructions on this list by a mile, as the strongest, toughest, greatest, when it's none of those things. Everything else we've talked about here is significantly better in almost every single way. There are ways you can make it better. Like, for example, Steve from Bedo's Leatherworks does what's called a rapid Goodyear welt construction, which is he mixes the McKay lock stitch from the stitch down to the inside of the boot to remove the gimming, and then stitches down from the outside to make a midsole layer that looks, that it's the thickness of a welt, but it looks like a welted boot, even though it's actually Blake stitched on the inside, which is the same as McKay lock stitch, and then done with this outsole machine to look like it's Goodyear welted on the outside, and that's what's known as a rapid Blake stitch. That's a way that mixes 2 methods together, and that one happens to have a name. Not all of these do, but that's kind of one of the realities here, that people do that because they've heard Goodyear welted shoes for a while, and they think, oh, Goodyear welted shoes is a sign of a good shoe. This is what I need to aim for. So you walk into the Allen Edmonds store, and he's trying to explain to you why his Goodyear welted shoe is just as good as your, Francis Walpinger in New York City is a bespoke dress shoemaker. Why it's just as good as your Francis Walpinger's flat welded shoe. And they're the exact same. They follow the same process. Once it's done by machine, we could do it at an eighth of a price and half the time and blah, blah, blah. And these marketing terms have led to, people mixing these together to try to explain why one is as good as another, when the reality is the Goodyear welting process was invented to, make the hand welting process significantly faster. That's why we're calling them Goodyear welted.
It's like we talked about in a previous episode about CXL. When you get into boots, when you get into something more than just off the shelf, or when you're starting to get into some of the higher quality off the shelves, and the one leather that you'll hear about as being the best over and over and over is CXL. And not a slight on CXL. It's a great leather. I'm not trying to go there. But like I said before, that's a leather where at some point in your journey, you think is the absolute best. And then you go a little bit further in your journey and you find stuff that's a whole lot better. That's exactly what we're talking about here. Exact same thing with the Goodyear welted. Start getting into it, and Goodyear welted. Everybody thinks it's great, and everybody talks about how great it is, and it's a really good construction. And you get deeper down the rabbit hole, and the next thing you know, oh, look, there's a lot of things better.
Yep, and it's just the nature of the beast on this one. Now, quite simply, what is this, talk accomplishing? We just wanted to kind of go through, take a step back after last week, where very clearly, we weren't 100% on the same page. Figure out why we weren't on the same page, and come back with a good report of where reality kind of lands here. Did we necessarily learn a lot from last week? I don't know. Depends a little bit from me and Jeff. There's things learned, not so much about the construction of shoes, more so about the muddiness and how to navigate, where one is one thing and not another thing in terms of like how they use the terms. But hopefully for everybody here, well, okay, it's still going to be clear as mud. Like let's be honest. The whole point of this is to show that it's never not going to be mud, and the only way to at least only have you be ankle deep in mud is to try to consistently use the same terms based on how we've defined them here. I do think the way that we've defined them, we've done a pretty good due diligence of lining them up with what high-end U.S. bootmakers would use and how they would use them. That's not going to help you in Europe. It's not 100% going to help you in Indonesia. We tried to use the Indonesian example to help explain their process on it, and hopefully that did help. But we're trying to centralize on how United States bootmakers would use these terms.
Trying to identify the mud. And as you look through it, there's a lot of things in common, all of this stuff that has gone through. Right? Sometimes it's just a little slight change becomes something different. And that the Norwegian for the Indonesian list that we just went through, difference between a Norwegian welt and a rolled hand welt is very small difference, but it's still a difference. So can't clear it up, but we pointed out all the different possibilities and all the different combinations and ways that they can all work together to come to what any individual boot builder decides best for making their own boots. Whether it's because they think it's the highest quality or because they think that it's best for their cost purposes or best for their environment, best for the amount of room that they have to operate in. I think the Indonesians are pretty tight for space in their working operations. I think I've seen some photos and they're kind of in some pretty tight cubicles sometimes with their little building zones. So lots of factors play into how a builder will decide to put it all together. And It'll be some combination of what we've talked about for an hour.
Mm-hmm.
It might not be any of the things, but it will be a combination of those things.
Yep.
There's really nothing else that you can do.
Yep. I mean, and everyone could throw a little spin on it, though. I swear to God, if any boot builders listening to this and you decide to make a construction I'm going to now deem called the shit construction, where you make your flat welt instead of out of a midsole matching piece, you make it out of an upper vamp piece to help muddy it more to make a flat welt look like a stitch down, I'm going to call it shit construction. Because this is the kind of crap we're talking about where people are intentionally making it muddy. Because you could literally take the piece you were going to use for the rolled welt and install it just like a flat welt. And besides seeing some gap there that you would have to take a little bit of effort with your fingers to figure out that they're two separate pieces, it would be almost impossible to decipher from Norwegian's welt that we showed in the picture, which is doing the Norwegian welt where you just pass it through and flip the upper out. You would not be able to tell those apart without cutting the boot apart. Like literally someone could call it Norwegian style Norwegian, and you could do it as a flat welt and nobody would ever know. You'd have no idea how to know the difference. And this is where we mean by mud. They're like that could be, and I have no doubt at some point in time a lot of these constructions were someone's like specialty, the thing they came up with that sold their boot and shoes 60, 70 years ago. It really feels like that is most likely the case. Like these were like specialties at some point in time that became a recognized construction type.
Could be just to be different, I guess, but it could be what they think is best. And they might be thinking long term versus thinking short term. They might be thinking about nobody would do anything but a resole on this. They could be thinking, well, eventually somebody's going to want to do a rebuild on this, and they may not want to take that into consideration when they're building it. Cork, that filler, that cavity, that's an example. If you're thinking short term, nothing's better than cork. Cork's great. Cork's the best. Cork is going to sink you down faster and give you that custom feel faster than anything else anybody could do. Long term, probably not so good. I don't like it. But short term, absolutely.
As long as the cavity.
And if you don't wear your shoes enough, or you're sitting on your ass most of the time to the point where you're never going to totally put that serious wear on a piece of footwear, that cork might be more than good enough for you for as long as you want to wear that shoe.
As long as the cavity is not huge. If it's like more than like a 1 or a 2 mil cavity, I would advocate probably never using cork. Now that's what a lot of companies do, but when the cavity gets that big, that's what allows the chunks to separate and create the lumpy parts that Jeff's talking about, which is the dreaded part of cork. When we're talking like flat welded boots, like quality ones, like for example Cobbler from Creosote, who uses cork, this is in like less than 0.5 millimeter kind of thickness amounts of cork. Like it's very different from, this much thickness in cork, which this is about what a standard Goodyear welted boot and shoe would have, is something closer to this much in terms of thickness. That's where something like leather is your friend, because even though it's not going to flex as much in the beginning, with a cavity that big, the second you sweat in it a bunch or get it wet a couple times and that water manages to penetrate in there and start breaking some of that glue up, that's where you get cork clumps that start shifting around and moving around a bunch. This is what people see in the Iron Ranger a lot.
Could be filled with jute, which doesn't seem like a really good idea to me. It could be filled with wool, which doesn't necessarily seem so bad to me. Maybe it is. I don't know. I've never talked to anybody or taken apart one where I've seen anything negative about it. But I do think that filling it with a piece of leather would be best. That would be my overall preference. So I was very happy to learn that Renav and Tahara both use leather as their filler on the models that need it. The point in bringing that up again was that not everything is always good and not everything is always bad. There's pros and cons, and there's reasons, good and bad, for why the choices are made.
Yep. And once again, it's clear as mud. Like I cannot put into words how finding 7 different pictures of Norwegian that are not the same are like, how do you turn this into a Norwegian definition? That's why we use the one picture with the 4 different Norwegian constructions on the same page of the same book to kind of show that point. And it uses clever play on words like Norwegian, well, or Norwegian, what did it call it? It called it Norwegian construction versus Norwegian welted construction versus Norwegian constructor versus, reverse welt constructed. Like, these are almost all essentially what we would call an L welt. Just one with physical welts, one without physical welts, and then the really stupid one where it put some vamp upper leather instead of regular midsole. These are not things that you would, always traditionally do, number one. But number two, they're fluid. We found 7 different pictures that don't match any of these for other kinds of Norwegian construction. They're all kind of sort of in the same vein, but they're not exactly the same. Like, the biggest thing is Norwegian really seems to clash on, should the upper be rolled out or not, like a stitch down? Should it exist below a welt? Should it exist above a welt? That doesn't seem to be a clear answer. The answer is it could literally be both. You could see upper turned out or you could not see upper turned out. Whether that's roll welted or even regular L welted. We found pictures with an L welt that had the upper flared out. And it's like, well, what's the point of even putting the L welt piece on at that point? Why are you creating extra holes for no reason? So, and that's what we kind of were getting at. Like, there's an 80%, reality here. And there's also a, like, maybe someone did this because it's their construction method. And a really good example of a story about this, and I've probably told this before, I'm going to tell it again because I'm from Kansas. The Cuban heel is not a Cuban heel. It has nothing to do with the country of Cuba. In 1870s, there was a bootmaker in Coffeyville, Kansas. Coffeyville was a famous trading post for the old cattle town. The cattle, they call it cow town, but the cattle trade back in the day. So the city of Wichita paid to get the railroad to install the railroad down there and made Wichita a cow town. And Coffeyville was one of the last trading posts on the way to Wichita. And the maker, John Cubine, Cubine, made Coffeyville-style boots there. Coffeyville-style boots were unique because they were a combination of meant for riding and walking. And so he had what was known as the Cubine heel, which was been boots made by John Cubine. Over time, Cubine got translated to Cuban, and we've called it a Cuban heel, but it's a Cubine heel from John Cubine. And there's plenty of pictures that exist. You can go see those style boots, and nowadays we actually more likely call it a dogger heel, because it's not a packer heel with a deep undercut. It's more of a walking heel, which is a dogger, which is the same thing as a Cuban. It's a roughly 12-degree angled heel internally.
Luckily, heels are a much clearer conversation.
Yes.
Besides the fact that we have the 2 names for the Cuban, Cubine,
and dogger, yep. We have woodsman.
We've got, dogger. I mean, everything else is clear except, well, historically we could the
woodsman and logger. Yep.
Woodsman versus the logger heel. Today, everywhere I see it, they're the same. It's synonyms. But I didn't realize this, but originally, apparently, the woodsman had less of an arc.
Yep. It was called
spoon arc.
Yeah, spoon bevel heel. It was more of a dress heel. That's what would have been more common on an engineer in the 50s, which, was really more of a dress fashion boot than it was a working boot, versus the logger cut that we're used to now, which is a much deeper groove that's meant for actual logging and, walking on uneven terrain.
So I thought that was interesting. I did find some pictures. I did look it up. You have a picture handy?
Nah, I don't. But think of like if you take a spoon from a table and you were to put the edge just slightly in and draw a line on it. That's the depth of it. It's really a very thin but a very elegant kind of shape. Gabbard from Creosote does a couple models with that spoon beveled edge heel, or sometimes I've seen it nowadays sometimes called as the dress woodsman, but it's the woodsman, whereas the logger's a very aggressive, like I took 2/3 of the spoon and levels of curve. But once again, that's weight reduction and meant for walking on uneven surfaces. Loggers sometimes also aren't the most comfortable when you first get them to walk on concrete and flat surfaces. That's why you wear the edge of them so quickly on a logger heel. If you're just walking purely on concrete, you'll get that kind of back curve. Like, I mean, I don't have the greatest gait ever, but you get kind of, this where you've kind of walked it off at a little bit of an edge, right? You get that kind of unshaped, like I say, even up you can see, you kind of walk this outside edge off more, and you see that real quickly with a logger heel.
I would say that a block is harder to break in.
Oh, block definitely
the logger
is.
actually agrees with my gait better, and I have less of that.
Oh, I agree. Tapered heels for life, 100% there. I hadn't got to the block yet. The block does that extremely quickly, but the block, at least in certain circles, is considered the manly heel.
I like that new blogger one. But I guess if I were to do that on an Indonesian, I'd have to send them a picture.
Oh, you definitely
I expect they have no fucking idea.
I don't think you could get half the American makers to make it would even know what the fuck it is, to be 100% honest with you. Like, you could send it over to Nick's, and I don't even know if they know what a blogger is.
So, that's what we had. A whole bunch of nothing. A whole bunch of forever muddy as fuck.
Yep.
But I guess you can identify the mud now. Or understand why you and your friend can't agree with each other.
Like I said, these are very 80% terms. I think for a long time we've used them too stoically, and they're definitely not. And it's not like definitely. I said it like as a negative term, but it's not in like a bad way. It's that there is artistic freedom in the definition that there probably should not be, especially if we're calling it a definition.
Not that there's a shoe police out there.
Talking to him. Wee wee wee.
Bad boys, bad boys.
Yep. Anyway, that's it.
I made it to the end. Congratulations.
I hoped. Yeah, I hope this helped. I hope this is enlightening to everybody about the shoe industry is definitely the Wild West, and anybody can kind of label anything they want. And since a lot of these things you cannot see with your naked eye, you gotta buy and cut them in half to be like, hey, look, you're wrong, fucker. And a lot of us aren't going to do that. It's not worth anybody's time to get into that. But like I said, I think we've done a good job here of getting concise, usable definitions that work within the 80% rule and give a reasonable starting and stopping point with room for some artistic freedom.
Thanks, guys.
See you next time.
Please like and subscribe. Loving the comments.
This one might be a heavy comment one.
Roger.
Gesundheit. Bye.
Vote.